Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We're here to present a new collective volume, Modern China in Flux, Networks, Mobility and Transformation, a book that brings together a group of scholars exploring Chinese history through the lens of network analysis and other computational methodologies. I am Christian Henriot, the volume's editor, and I'm joined today by two of our contributors, Cécile Armand, who is next to me here, and Nora Bosch, who will be joining us online from Leuven. We'll take you through the core ideas and key contributions of the book in a conversational format.
So tell us what this book is about.
This book is about change, about how networks of people, ideas, and institutions shape modern China. But it is also about methodological transformation. How historians today can use digital tools to study those networks in ways that were previously not possible. Across chapters, we examine topics like female intellectuals and their cultural ties, Chinese engineers in the national state, student mobility between China and Europe, business elites in post-war Shanghai, technocrats and agricultural experts, and so on and more. What unites these studies is the commitment to empirical research and analytical innovation, using network analysis not as a metaphor, but as a rigorous tool to uncover historical structures and dynamics. In this short presentation, we won't go chapter by chapter. Instead, we'll focus on two guiding questions. First, how have historians in this volume adapted computational and network methods to different kinds of historical sources? And second, what new insights have emerged from this approach? Insights we might not have reached through conventional means. These questions are central to our purpose. We want this book not only to present original research, but also to serve as an invitation to experiment, to expand the historian's methodological toolbox. And so, Cécile, what do we mean by network analysis?
Yeah, so at its core, it's quite simple. You have entities called nodes and relationships between them called edges or ties. But these simple components allow us to model very complex systems. Kinship ties, political factions, institutional affiliations, or information flows. So what makes network analysis so powerful for historians is its flexibility. It's not a fixed method. It adapts to the data and the questions we have. So in this volume, you will see a wide variety of sources transformed into networks. So let me give you a few examples. For example, in my own chapters, I use a 1936 alumni directory from the American University Club in Shanghai, and I combine it with Who is Who biographical entries. Another example is Torben Pelzer's chapters, who starts from career, records of engineers drawn from databases, and archival lists. And he used these sources to study professional mobility and state power. In another chapter, your chapter actually, you use wartime newspapers and industrial directories to map out Shanghai industrial elite in 1947. In some cases, the sources are structured and digital. In other cases, they are textual or fragmentary and they require extraction, cleaning, and judgment. So the key point is that network analysis begins with the sources, but it forces us to rethink how we define and represent relationships. For example, is a letter a tie? Is shared education a connection? Does appearing in the same organization imply influence? These are key historical questions and not just technical ones. And that's why network analysis is more than a set of tools. It's a way of rethinking historical evidence and making the structure of social life visible and comparable.
That brings us to one of the most vivid examples of this approach. Cécile, in your own chapter, how did network analysis help you rethink elite formation in Republican era Shanghai?
Yes, so my chapter offers a compelling look at elite formation and international mobility in Republican era China through the lens of the American University Club in Shanghai. This club was founded in 1902 and it brought together hundreds of Chinese graduates from American University, and by the mid-1930s, it had become one of the city's most prestigious institutions. So my approach is significant in two ways. First, I treat the club directory not just as a list of names, a list of members, but as a starting point for a network-based reconstruction of professional trajectories and social connections. So I linked the 1936 directory to biographical data from who is who in China, and this allowed me to follow how these individuals moved through careers, institution, and urban space. Second, my use of network analysis is historically grounded and conceptually rich. I don't only look at who knew whom, but I ask what kind of path led to elite status, which combination of education, employment, and association membership produce prestige and visibility. And what the networks reveals is that elite status in 1930s Shanghai wasn't based on a single factor, like we once studied, but rather on a multiplex of affiliations: business, education, state service, or civic organizations. Moreover, the network makes visible the unequal distribution of prestige within the American educated elite. It wasn't a cohesive group. Some individuals were deeply embedded across multiple domains, while others remained marginal or isolated. This diversity might be lost in a simple list or static prosopography, but it emerged clearly through network structure. So ultimately, this chapter used a network analysis combined with historical sensitivity culture to illuminate the relational pathway through which elites were formed and recognized in Republican China. It also highlights how urban institutions like the American University Club served as both mirrors and makers of elite status. So now, while my case focused on urban elite, I know that Torben Pelzer took a very different route into the world of engineer and state building. So Christian, can you walk us through what he found?
Absolutely. Pelzer's work tackles a very classic question. Was there an early technocracy in China? Did engineers help run the nationalist state, or were they simple technical staff far from the levers of power? Pelzer uses a large-scale prosopographic database that he developed with over 17,000 engineers. He applies network analysis to identify institutional clusters like railways, ministries, commissions, and sequence analysis to reconstruct career trajectories across time. What network analysis does, in his case, is to reveal a fragmented technostructure. Engineers were not a united force. Their influence and career paths diverge sharply, depending on sub-discipline like civil, electrical, mining, engineering, and on which institution employed them. Civil engineers, for example, dominated railways and communications. Mining and electrical engineers clustered in the National Resource Commission, which served as a springboard for a handful to enter political office. Sequence analysis, on the other hand, showed that only a very small minority about 130 engineers, made the leap into high political roles. Even fewer reached the executive levels of government. Importantly, these elite engineers often shared US degrees and elite social backgrounds. In other words, Peltzer's analysis showed that the idea of a broad-based technocratic elite in the 1930s and 40s is deeply misleading. Network methods let him map invisible institutional ecosystems. Sequence analysis added a temporal dimension, helping to spot when and how careers broke into elite status or didn't. Together, these methods provide a much more nuanced picture of the limits and structures of technocratic power in Republican China, one that challenges both earlier optimism and later retrospective myths. Now, if Peltzer's chapter takes us into formal bureaucratic structures, Lin Lingling's paper brings us somewhere very different, into literary salon and kinship ties. And I would like to ask Cécile, what stood out for you in her approach?
Yeah, indeed. Liang Liling approach leads us to a very different kind of network, one that is not institutional or professional, but rather cultural and affective. Liang Liling chapters focuses on a group of elite women writers in the Jiangnan region who lived through the transition from the Qing to the Republic. She explored how their poetry, correspondence, commemorative writing, and kinship ties sustain a form of elite women's culture well into the early 20th century. And rather than building a single formalized network, Liang Liling uses network thinking heuristically to trace overlapping circles of literary affiliation, family connection, and emotional solidarity. She shows how cultural capital and social memory were transmitted across generations, even in the absence of formal institutional recognition. What's especially important there is the shift in perspective, a shift from male-centered institutional power to the intimate and informal realms where women build alternative forms of authority and continuity. So her works remind us that network analysis is not just about scale or precision. It can also be a tool for recovering fragile, often overlooked connections, especially in gendered spaces where the archive is sparse or fragmented. And from women writers in late Qing China, we are going to jump to transnational education. So Nora, your chapter explores a very different kind of student experience in 1920s and 1930s Belgium. Can you tell us more?
Thank you, Cécile. So my chapter focuses on the Chinese education mobility in Belgium. Specifically, I look at the Chinese student populations of 5 Belgian schools, with the specific focus on the interbellum period from 1919 to 1939. Based on the biographical dictionary compiled by Wang Qingyu and other archival material, I created datasets that document the background and the education trajectories of Chinese students and use these datasets to compare the 5 schools in terms of age of enrollment and place of origin over time. What the chapter gives is a more nuanced understanding of Chinese education migration to Belgium. That is, that some waves of students coming from a specific province are tied to the enrollment patterns at particular institutions, and that even a school has a regional shift in terms of Chinese demographics. These findings are the result of prosopography, data visualization, and statistics, and they are a good case of how digital methods are beneficial to historical research, not only because these findings cannot be replicated with existing historical sources that only document fragments of Chinese student inflow, but the methods also allows us to track patterns using different scales. In the case of the chapter, it was like schools and national scales, and allows us to probe the relationship between more national trend, like between national and local trends in student mobilities in Belgium.
Thank you, Nora. So let's now return to East Asia and pick up a different thread: family strategies and intergenerational mobility in Taiwan, explored in a chapter by Tania Luchosova. So Tanya's chapters relies on a large biographical database and focuses on prominent Taiwanese lineage, tracing 125 family members across 5 generations from the late Qing into the post-war period. Using a prosopographical method and a structured biographical data, she maps out a network of kinship, education, and professional affiliation. And what network analysis brings here is a way to visualize and compare recurring pathways. Repeated attendance at elite Japanese and Taiwanese institutions, marital alliances that reinforce intra-elite ties, and a strong emphasis on professions like medicine, education, and public service. And the result is not just a family tree. It's a relational map of how social capital was cultivated, circulated, and preserved through carefully managed choices across generations. Importantly, the chapter highlights how these strategies shifted over time. For instance, the colonial era emphasis on Japanese education gave way after 1945 to local universities as new centers of prestige. Yet, the underlying logic of intergenerational transmission through education and marriage remained remarkably consistent. Tanya's work shows how network analysis can enrich biographical history, especially when used to trace invisible continuities across political ruptures. It also reminds us that elite persistence is not just institutional. It's deeply embedded in family-level strategies of adaptation and alliance. So finally, this work on elite families brings us back to question of status and visibility, question that you also explore in your chapter on Shanghai industrial elite in 1947. So Christian, can you say a few words about that?
Of course. My aim in this study was to move beyond the traditional company or sector-based studies of Chinese industry and instead take a prosopographical approach to reconstruct the collective biography of the city's top industrialists and the network they inhabited. The methodological challenge was substantial. Industrialists, as a social group, rarely left behind clear, coherent traces. They did not necessarily see themselves as a class or act collectively. So the question became for me, how can we identify who counted as an industrialist in Shanghai? How did they operate within broader social and institutional networks? Here is where network analysis became not just useful but essential. I drew on 2 major corpora. A 1947 industrial survey that listed all the factory owners and managers in post-war Shanghai, from which I extracted a sample of more than 300 top industrialists. And then 2 rich but different textual sources. The Shanghai newspaper, which captured everyday social and political activity, and a series of who is who's, as in the case of Cécile, which recorded biographical snapshots and institutional affiliations. Using computational tools, I extracted and standardized mentions of these individuals across These corpora, across thousands of articles in the Shenpao and hundreds of biographies in the Who is Who, this allowed me to build two affiliation networks. One that showed how industrialists appeared in the press, in action, in public life through events, meetings, and institutions, and another one based on their formal roles recorded in the directories. What did this analysis reveal? Well, first, industrialists were not defined by their companies. Well, in the Shenpao, industrialists, in fact, appear in social events mostly, weddings, banquets, fundraising campaigns, municipal meetings, and so on. They surface as members of society, not as business owners. In the Who is Who, by contrast, they appear as members of boards, directorships, committees, etc. But again, what comes through is that most industrialists held multiple overlapping roles in banking, in civic association, in government commissions, and so on. And for me, network analysis provided two main dimensions, two key dimensions. First, it exposed hidden linkages. Industrialists were embedded in a web of shared affiliations, such as co-investments, professional boards, civic roles. Second, it identified the central brokers in these various networks, especially figures like Wang Xiaolai, Tu Yuesheng, and Qian Yongming, who emerge as crucial connectors. They were not necessarily the biggest factory owners, but they were at the crossroads of finance, business, and politics. In short, network analysis helped me reconstruct a power elite that was not merely economic, but institutional and relational. Of course, network analysis has its limits, in the sense that industrials were not connected as industrialists. Instead, the commonality lay in their shared entanglements with other spheres. And this is a broader insight. In studying modern Chinese elites, we can't reduce influence or power to economic capital or party membership, for example. We need to account for position in a complex ecosystem, something that network analysis let us map with clarity. And that's exactly the point we want to drive through this book. Network analysis not as a blueprint, in fact, but as a set of flexible tools. And each of us had to adapt them to our questions, to our sources, and to our constraints. And in that regard, Cécile, perhaps you can review this for our readers.
Yes, so across the chapters, we see a diversity of approaches. Some contributors use formal network metrics. Others use networks more exploratively or heuristically, depending on their sources and their questions. The tools themselves also vary. Gephi or Cytoscape for network modeling and visualization. Some people use Palladio for lightweight relational analysis. Others use R or Python for more customized workflows. And even manual extraction, Vari or Diagram, when data was sparse or ambiguous. But the point is not that is not which software we used. The point is that the method adapts to the questions and to the sources as well, and not the other way around. And in all cases, the historian remains central, making decisions about what counts as a tie, how to model time and uncertainty, and how to interpret patterns in their context. And as you put in the introduction, if I may quote the introduction, we do not view network analysis as a definitive mode of explanation, but as a productive and flexible tool for historical inquiry, one that encourages formalization without sacrificing historical judgment. And that's why this book is as much about methodological creativity as it is about data. It reflects a broader shift from digital history as a niche field to digital methods as part of the historian's broader toolkit.
I'd like to conclude this presentation by returning to the broader aims of modern China in Flux. This volume is first and foremost a contribution to modern Chinese history, but one that's rooted in the historian's craft. We've brought together scholars who didn't just adopt computational methods, but adapted them, tailored them, customized them to their questions, to their sources, to their fields of expertise. Second, it's a collection of empirically grounded case studies. Each chapter is based on deep archival work, on prosopographical reconstruction, or on close engagement with textual and visual material. These are not abstract exercises. They are historically rich, methodologically rigorous contributions to the study of modern China. And finally, again, the book is an invitation to historians to experiment, to test boundaries, to rethink method without abandoning context. And again, I would like to quote from our introduction, rather than proposing a new orthodoxy, we see the volume as a space of exploration, a space where digital techniques serve historical inquiry, not the other way around. If this book encourages others to ask new questions or to look at familiar sources through a new lens, then it will have done its job. And we hope that will happen. We thank you for your attention and feel free to contact us and join us in our conversation.